Thank you. Thank you. Hey. Normally I always say thank you, both of you, but that doesn't apply here. My goodness. First of all, I want to thank you for sticking to your guns. I understand they tried to palm off Ken Ham on you instead of me. And you said, Dave or nothing, and that's good. Just don't let them... Just kidding, just kidding. Well, this is the organization I represent, Answers in Genesis. How many have been to the museum? I've talked to a few people. I'm sure if you just see who has been there, they would recommend a trip to Kentucky to see our museum. It is a 2-day affair if you're driving, 12 hours of driving, but the flight is a little faster, and you can get a direct flight from here right into Cincinnati, and once you're in Cincinnati at the airport, you're 5 miles from the museum, right on the interstate. So we hope to see you all out there. Well, I traveled about the country speaking a little bit. I retired in the year 2000 and started working on a part-time basis with Answers in Genesis, speaking all over the country. And then just a year ago, January 1st, I went full-time. So sold my house in St. Louis. I got $1.98 out of it. And of course, it had some acreage. And I bought a house in Kentucky, and so I'm a genuine Kentuckian. And I haven't learned how to speak Kentucky yet, but I'm working on it. Well, let's get into this talk. Everybody's interested in the origin of man. I mean, not too many people are interested in the origin of snails or cockroaches or moths or whatever. But when people talk about the origin of man, it draws some attention. And I think it's the whole idea of human evolution that probably sticks in the craw of Christians and creationists more than anything else. I thought I would kind of get you in the mood for the talk this evening by showing you an exhibit that's been going on in London. It's called the Human Exhibit. You can go to the local zoo, the London Zoo, and there they have college students who've agreed to be the animals in the zoo. And so you go through and you can see them. You're not supposed to feed them, but you can see them in the cage there, and people have really sort of been titillated by this. This zoo visitor said, it's hilarious. It turns everything upside down. It makes you think about humans in relation to the animals. Somebody else going through the zoo said, seeing people in a different environment among other animals teaches members of the public that the human is just another primate. Someone else going through said, a lot of people think humans are above other animals. When they see humans as animals here, it kind of reminds us we're not that special. Isn't that encouraging? I mean, you go to the zoo. Well, I put this talk together some years ago. It's called Lucy, She's No Lady. For starters, it's probably a male. And things kind of go down the hill from there. But we're going to have a critical examination of Australopithecus afarensis. Now you might wonder, why are we picking on this particular ape man? Well, there are a lot of ape men, as you know, or creatures believed to be ape men, and I believe they can all be fairly easily, wherever there's enough evidence to look at, be distinguished as either human or ape. I don't believe God made any ape men. But this is the one that's caught the public attention more than any other ape man. And this is the one I think that really impresses scientists most. So if we can critically evaluate this specimen, or this general type of specimen, Australopithecus afarensis, we can use pretty much the same sort of a critique or approach to critically evaluate the other so-called hominid ancestors. Lucy's so important that she's actually left her home country and has moved for 6 years to the United States, where over the next 6 years she will be on display at 10 museums. And for $25 to $30 a pop, you too can go and venerate some ape bones. Right now, Lucy's at the Houston Museum of Natural History. She'll be there for quite a while. The exhibit is called Lucy's Legacy, The Hidden Treasures of Ethiopia, which is where the specimen was found. This is what it looks like. We have a replica of this in our museum in Kentucky. It's about a 40% complete skeleton of a creature very much like a pygmy chimp, although you don't want to say that around them. They get offended. But you might be interested in just getting on the internet and looking at the Houston Museum. You'll see they're making a lot of hoopla about this. This is one of the screens you see. With regard to Lucy, they ask, how do you relate? I would have thought a better question would be, do you relate? But no, how do you relate? Notice the question's loaded. Another question they raise is, her story is your story. So in other words, if you see Lucy, look into her, you're really looking into your own background and history. She is being accompanied, or he as the case may be, to our country by a representative from Ethiopia, from the National Museum there. I won't try to pronounce the name, I'll probably get it all wrong, but here she is. And she's apparently going to be over here during the time the specimen's in our country. And she obviously is very close to this specimen. She says, I have an emotional thing with her. I have trouble thinking of her as a fossil sometimes. I sometimes consider her as a human being that has life in her. Well, it takes a fair amount of imagination from a rather beat-up monkey skeleton that's 40% complete. But a lot of people have visited the exhibit so far, and they consider it, at least the ones that have blogs that I've read, well worth the money spent. Even a lot of atheists are having genuinely religious experiences, just contemplating the skeleton of this particular ape. For example, this gentleman has a blog site that I looked in on, and he said, I stood and stared at her. This is the Lucy specimen. I stood and stared at her for as long as my family would let me. Can't you just see the family? Come on, they're monkey bones, come on. I had butterflies in my stomach the whole time to look down at that little 3-foot, 8-inch skeleton, knowing how long ago she lived and how closely related we are to her. No words can do justice to the feeling you get. So he definitely got his $25 worth. The interesting thing is if you look around on the website for the Houston Museum, what about this? This is one thing I read there. For many years, Lucy was thought to be a direct human ancestor, but we now see her as belonging to a separate group of hominids from those which became our species, Homo sapiens. You get the picture here? Forget about it. She's not our direct ancestor. And yet, look what they say. Still, Lucy remains the benchmark. So she's not our ancestor, but she's the benchmark by which our ancestors are judged. Lucy remains the benchmark by which all other discoveries are judged. Lucy has become a household name known by scientists and non-scientists worldwide. She continues to inspire exploration of our ancient ancestors in order to discover more about the progress of mankind. So this is the reference standard. This is as good as it gets. I mean, we're going to look at the best shot that evolutionists have for human evolution, dealing with what is clearly not a human. It is definitely ape-like, but one that they believe is just a certainty, has something to do with man, although did not evolve directly into us. Well, a lot of teachers are taking their children to the Houston Museum, and during the 6 years that this specimen will be in our country, you can be sure that there will be millions of young children down into the early grades that will be taken in to contemplate these ape bones. For example, if you get on the Houston website, there's a whole section there for elementary school teachers. What should you emphasize? When the students come back from the museum, you know, what sort of in-class exercises should you do to hammer home the essential truth of our relatedness to Lucy? This gets a little technical. Some of you may not be able to follow it, but do your best. The teacher is told to ask the students, when and why did our ancestors start walking upright? Notice you are not to ask, did they start walking upright? Do we have ape-like ancestors? No. When and why? Then here it starts to get a little technical. Try to stay with me. We get into some math here. Put the students in groups of 2. Number each student 1 or 2. I told you it was going to get a little technical. Ask student number 1 to put his hands on the floor and walk on all 4 limbs around the classroom. Discuss with your partner, would you rather walk on 2 legs or 4? A related question would be, would you rather have a sharp stick in the eye or not? Why do you think apes began walking on 2 legs? Notice again, not did apes walk on 2 legs, but why did they? I mean, can you imagine the answers? Man, it was so hard in my back crawling on 4. It really felt good to get... That's it. It felt good. That's how they evolved. Here's the question. Is human evolution compatible with the Bible? No. Well, that's pretty much the end of my talk. We'll open for questions. Okay, expect a little bit more at today's flight expense. Okay, let's dig in a little further then. First, I want to establish the attitude of the evolutionary community on their confidence of the whole evolutionary paradigm. Notice I don't call evolution a theory. It's not. I have people come up to me all the time and say, I don't have to believe in evolution after all. It's only a theory. You know what I tell them? If evolution were a theory, you ought to consider believing in it. But it doesn't measure up. It's a paradigm. It represents the sum total that the contemporary scientist seems to be willing to consider. That is, there's only matter, energy, time, and space. There's nothing else. There's nothing supernatural. So we can look nowhere except the intrinsic properties of nature to account for our existence. And you see this in Julian Huxley. He's one of the Huxleys. Thomas Huxley was called Darwin's bulldog. They've been great defenders of evolutionism. And in his book, Evolution After Darwin, he said, in the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer either need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, our mind and our soul, as well as our brain and body, and so did religion. In fact, think about it. Talk about a Johnny-come-lately. 14 billion years of cosmic evolution, and religion finally gets invented by primitive man just in the last nanoseconds of this whole sweep on a relative scale. So far from religion or God explaining how the world came to be, evolution explains how God became contrived, invented in the minds of man. The Bible has a very different view on all of this. I know you're aware of that. 1 Corinthians 15:39 tells us that all flesh is not the same flesh. But there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of animals, another of fish, another of birds. In other words, these are different kinds of creatures. They're not interrelated. They are a different flesh altogether. In Psalm 100, one of my favorite psalms, we read, "Know that the Lord, He is God. It is He who has made us, and not we ourselves." This is pretty much it right here. It is God who has made us, and not we ourselves. We are His people and the sheep of His pasture. And then Jesus Himself reveals His approach to creation, and particularly that of man. When asked about divorce, He responded and said, "Have you not read?" I love that. He just says, "Don't you folks read your Bibles?" That was basically the response. "Have you not read that He," and that would have been the Old Testament, right, that they would have read because the New Testament was available yet. "Have you not read that He who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." From the beginning, not the Big Bang, creation of man and woman from the beginning. And this is the whole basis of marriage. Well, people sometimes argue that Darwin never said we evolved from monkeys. In fact, back during the Scopes trial, the defense of teacher John Scopes tried to argue that Darwin never claimed man evolved from monkeys. In fact, even today, if you say that, evolutionists get very upset. Even if you say that they evolved from apes, they want you to say ape-like creatures, and certainly not monkeys. Apes are basically tailless monkeys. But if you look at Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, written a few years after Origin of Species, He said that the Simiidae then branched off into two great stems, the New World and the Old World monkeys. That would be M-O-N-K-E-Y-S, for those of you sitting way back. That would be monkeys. And from the latter, that would be monkeys, at a remote period, man, the wonder and glory of the universe, proceeded from the monkeys. Yeah. Now, a fellow that was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, who was writing and doing his work right about the time of the publication of Origin of Species. In fact, this drawing was made between the Origin of Species and Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, in 1867. Some of you may have heard of Ernst Haeckel. He's widely considered to have been essentially a charlatan, not a real scientist. But he did much to popularize evolution. In fact, this is one of the first attempts to deal with the so-called specifics of evolution, starting with a single cell, going through all these stages on up to this gentleman here. I got this out of a biology textbook, and I couldn't believe what they said about this drawing by Haeckel, who, by the way, if you're familiar with his work on recapitulation, he actually falsified the data, used the same woodcut more than once to show how similar pigs and humans are and what have you as an embryo. In the book, look what they say. This is a biology textbook. Although this genealogical chart, starting with a blob of protoplasm up here, and continuing to a modern Papua, that's the gentleman down here, although this is filled with misconceptions and fictitious creatures, it's fairly accurate. Am I missing something here? I mean, apparently it didn't go by you either. I mean, fairly accurate. Let's give him his due. Fairly accurate considering the dearth of knowledge in his day. In other words, how little we knew then. And of course, things have not changed greatly to this day, as you will see. There are really four primary assumptions, starting assumptions, that impact on our interpretation of the fossil record as it relates to the origin of man. First, all origins must be explained in strictly naturalistic terms. That is, in terms of human evolution, one must not in any way, shape, or form, directly or indirectly, bring in a supernatural event, a god, etc. So we must confine all explanations to strictly naturalistic terms. And this isn't just simply a rule of the game. Another part of this is we must exclude the possibility of anything ever being non-naturalistic. So it's not like we're just limiting our own explanations, but there can be no other explanation. Here's the second little rule. Similarity proves evolutionary ancestry. That there can't be any other basis for similarity, which we sometimes call homology, than that we share a common evolutionary ancestor. The third axiom is that man has evolved from ape-like ancestors. This is not a point that's debated or questioned by evolutionists. And finally, at least some ape-like fossils that we find as we dig around must be our ancestors. Why? Because, well, as one evolutionist said, if they're not, we wouldn't have any ancestors. So at least some of the fossils we dig up just have to be our evolutionary ancestors. But not all evolutionists are equally confident about our results thus far. Richard Lewontin is a professor at Harvard University. He's a self-professed atheist and Marxist and certainly an evolutionist. He said, and I quote, in Human Diversity, he said, despite the excited and optimistic claims that have been made by some paleontologists, no fossil hominid species can be established as our direct ancestor. And you know, when you look at the tables, you certainly get that impression. Here's a typical diagram of human evolution starting with insectivores down here. And notice all the question marks in there. At every branch you see question marks, or they ought to be there if not shown, because most of these charts do show dotted lines and question marks, indicating that these are speculations. And if we take this last step from an Australopithecine to man, that's supposed to have occurred over the last 5 million years, give or take a week or two, one way or another. Here is the common ancestor of modern apes and modern man. Now, sometimes you'll hear creationists say, If man evolved from apes, how come we still have apes? That's really not a good point to make, because evolutionists would point out that African apes didn't evolve into man, so you wouldn't expect their numbers to be diminished because man is evolving. That rather modern apes and modern humans share a common ancestor 5 million years ago, and of course that common ancestor is a much debated point. I haven't even chosen to take a stab here. These dotted lines are fairly typical of what you see in these charts, and they oftentimes include the question marks. In case you don't realize, dotted lines means conjecture or speculation. So what we can see is if you were to take that all away, it just simply means this organism lived from here to here virtually unchanged. This one lived from here to here unchanged, here to here unchanged. One thing I find interesting in these diagrams is notice the ancestors leading up to man. Now notice the ancestors from our common ancestor leading up to African apes. It's as though we've told the African apes, if you're interested in your evolution, figure it out for yourself. We're working on humans. Now, all of the creatures you see here are Australopithecines. That's what the A stands for. And Australopithecus is a word that simply means, take it apart, Australo means like in Australian, it means south. My friend Ken Ham from Australia says he's from the deep south. And Pithecus, wherever you see the word Pithecus, Pithecus means ape. So if any creature has Pithecus in the name, whatever else we can say about it, it is an ape. So these are all Australopithecines indicated here up until you get to Homo. This is Ramitis and Anamensis and Afarensis and Africanus used to be an ancestor of ours, but notice it's been put off in a side shoot. We call this a collateral relative. Didn't quite make it to man, made it part way and got into a side shoot or a dead end and didn't go any further. So a hominid is really any primate that is a known ancestor of man or a collateral relative, which means there would be no hominids, except perhaps man himself. Now we're going to be looking at this one right here. This is Australopithecus afarensis. This is Lucy. Lucy's the common name. Admitted, it's easier to say Lucy than Australopithecus afarensis. So oftentimes people will just use the word Lucy when they mean this whole species. Well, before we dig in any further, let's look at some sobering comments made by evolutionists. These are definitely not creationists we're talking about here. This gentleman said, even with DNA sequence data, we have no direct access to the process of evolution. So objective reconstruction of the vanished past can be only achieved by what? Creative imagination. You got it. Maybe he's the only one that feels that way, huh? Well, this gentleman writing in Time magazine, of course they spend a great deal of time pointing out our evolution. This article, How Man Began, in 1994. Different author, similar conclusion. The only certainty in this data-poor, imagination-rich, endlessly fascinating field is that there are plenty of surprises left to come. Yeah, that kind of data will lead to a lot of surprises. Several years ago, I was at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. They actually had a multi-million-dollar evolution exhibit, all based on like a carnival theme. They had these, you know, like the two-headed cow, you pay an extra quarter to see the bearded lady, whatever. And the paintings are always more impressive than the real thing. Remember that from the carnival posters? This is the kind of stuff they actually had at the Field Museum of Natural History. Look at this thing. Nobody believes, no evolutionist believes this. This is just a ludicrous caricature, and yet the sign says, human ancestor, question mark? Up above, the missing link, question mark? Mammal-like rept. What on earth is this supposed to convey to visitors to the museum? Well, Science 81, magazine that is no longer in publication because the year 82 rolled around, kind of killed it, but anyway. Said, in the view of many paleoanthropologists, those are the people that study fossils of human ancestry, in the view of many paleoanthropologists, the story, and there's your right word for it, never mind theory, the story of human evolution has been fictionalized to suit needs other than scientific rigor. My sentiments exactly. Now, let's just look at what they do. The first thing you do to convince the public that we have an evolutionary ancestor or that birds are evolved from reptiles or whatever, the first thing you do is hire an artist. And if the artist wishes to be paid, he or she will paint what they're told to paint. And this is back when Australopithecus africanus was sort of thought to be one of our human ancestors. This is clearly an ape, no longer considered to be ancestral. But let me tell you what grinds me. There's certain things in life that really irritate me. One are paintings of ape-like ancestors of man. I mean, I go through life with a posture like this, and every one of these ape men look like a Marine drill sergeant. And look at these hands. Absolutely human hands. We know for a fact these Australopithecines didn't have hands like that. I mean, that's an absolute fact, and yet look at the hands. And tools. And the contemplative gaze. It's interesting. The author said, I wanted to get a human soul into this ape-like face to indicate something about where it was headed. So the artist can convey whatever it is they wish to convey. You'll certainly see that when we look at our exhibit in St. Louis. That exhibit is based on Lucy. And this is Lucy here. Okay, you guys, there'll be no whistling. It's a 40% complete primate. That's a lot of bones for a primate. Normally you're lucky to find just a piece of mandible or some teeth or whatever. By the way, did you hear about the evolutionist that found a small fragment of molar and immediately determined that it was a human ancestor, an ape-like ancestor of man? And he really got excited. He said, wow, I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't believed it. So Donald Johanson is attributed as discovering this fossil. Actually, there were several other people, Morris Taib and others that were with him. We usually blow them off and just think of Johanson. And he found it in Ethiopia back in 1974. And this is the specimen that is in Houston today and will be traveling all around the United States. This ape is dated at 3 million years old, but I want you to recall one thing about Lucy. She's been dated more than any cheerleader you know. I mean, they have had all kinds of dates. She's been as young as 2 million years old. In fact, originally they had it a couple of million years old, and then Richard Leakey found KMNER 1470 that was very human-like, and it was older. And if you read this book, Lucy, The Beginnings of Humankind by Johanson and Eddy, published in 1981, they actually tell you that they had to throw out the radiometric dating because it didn't make any sense. And they went to a guy named Basil Cook, who studies pig teeth. I know you're wondering, what does pig teeth have to do with determining how old Lucy is and what have you. Basil Cook's pigs, he said, are evolving over the same 5 million years that man is evolving. And by looking at what pig teeth he finds in what strata, and he knows exactly the time scale for the evolution of these pigs, by finding appropriate pig teeth, he can tell you how old your ape fossils are, whatever you find in what is believed to be similar strata. We sometimes call this kind of thing an index fossil. The thing that's amazing about Basil Cook is you tell him up front what you'd like, and he generally finds it's quite possible when he contemplates the pig teeth. But this is a remarkably complete skeleton, and notice we have bones just on one side, the femur from the left, the innominate or hip bone from the left, but it's quite possible to make a mirror image, you know, specimen and put it on the right. So if you have the left, you have the right as far as just studying function and shape. This is what the skull of Australopithecus afarensis looks like. This skull is primitive by ape standards. There's nothing about this skull that would literally shout, I'm about to turn into a human. A very sloping, shovel-like face. Another distinctive feature of apes is you can't see into the orbits from the side. Notice this bone comes right up. You sort of know there's an orbit back there, but you have to get around the front to see it. The human orbit is cut back quite far. There are no apes that have ever been discovered that have a cut back orbit on the side. No apes that have a completely flat face like man, top to bottom here. Small cranial capacity, in fact, small by ape standards. This is what you call your basic ape. But the rest of the body is believed to be quite human-like. This is the exhibit in the St. Louis Zoo, and this is an amazing exhibit. It's very lifelike. It's a man with hair coming out of it. You look at it, and from the neck on up, it is an ape, but from the neck down, quite distinctively, a human female. You see virtually human trunk, breasts, genitalia, arms and hands, legs and feet, posture and gait, and pensive gaze. In fact, this babe has actually had modeling training. We can tell that because models know that if you point the toe, you extend the leg. And she's doing that. I mean, if you trim the hair off these legs, you could use them in a Hanes ad. Other than an ape head, the only thing about the body you're seeing here that might be the least bit questionable as being fully human are the arms are a little bit longer than you normally would expect to see. Otherwise, completely human. I've sat in the St. Louis Zoo and watched the teachers bring the little children through. And it's just amazing. You got these kids that can't spell or pronounce Australopithecus afarensis, who know nothing of the scientific evidence, yet they look at this silly mannequin, which, by the way, is only about this tall, and they say, "Oh, look, Miss Ferguson, an ape man." And, of course, Miss Ferguson corrects them. This is an ape woman. It's even politically correct. You can't touch it. So that is the exhibit. Very powerful to communicate that man is a beast using art. Now, let's take a closer look. You know what she's doing, don't you? What is she doing? Thinking. In fact, we've even dug up the fossilized thought. We know what she's thinking. She's thinking, I don't have a thing to wear. Okay, so that part's not true, but the other things I'm telling you are true. And look at these hands. There's no question you can play piano or violin or type on a keyboard with those kind of hands and fingers. The thing that's incredible is at the time this exhibit was constructed, we had all the evidence we needed to know that this is not correct at all. It's a fabrication. I called it to the attention of the St. Louis Zoo, and in the St. Louis Compost-Dispatch, their newspaper, a Post-Dispatch, the zoo responded when I said, you know, we knew that this was not the way the original Lucy looked from the papers of Stearns and Foster, or Stern and Sussman rather than others. The museum came back with this comment. They said, well, we know it's not anatomically accurate, but it conveys the impression we wish to give, so we're not going to change it. That's it. That's science. Well, who are Stern and Sussman? What they did, these gentlemen, publishing American Journal of Physical Anthropology back in 1983, before this specimen was made, and this is a big paper, page 279 through 312, they looked at what we call the Hadar Australopithecines. These are the kinds of creatures that Lucy is supposedly, presumably the same species, and that's another whole issue. I would submit they really don't know what's the same species and what isn't. I could show you a male gorilla skull and a female gorilla skull, and if you did not know them from life, no one could talk fast enough to convince you they're the same species or even the same genera. Because in primates, we get a lot of what we call sexual dimorphism, where the male and the female are strikingly different, particularly in the skull. So who knows? I mean, a lot of these creatures may just be male and female that we're calling two different species, but let's play the game. If we take Lucy-type specimens and you look at the radius of curvature of the fingers, apes that have suspensory adapted hands for grasping limbs have highly curved, long, highly curved fingers that just naturally fit the limbs. They have other specializations too. The scapula, for example, where the humerus, the upper bone here, goes into the socket, that socket is tilted up to allow the arm to be up here in a more relaxed position. For us, when we lift our arm this far, we can't go any further without rotating our whole shoulder blade the rest of the way. And it's because all those muscles in the back are rotating the shoulder blade that it's wearisome to hold your arms like this very long. But suspensory adapted apes have up-tilted glenoid fossas. That's the thing the shoulder fits into there, or the arm bone fits into. And Lucy has the up-tilted glenoid fossa. I mean, she is a suspensory adapted ape anatomically. But when they looked at the curvature of the fingers, this is Lucy, and this is human, and these are other living apes here. So Lucy is always the circles. And with the exception of this one odd outer layer here that's by itself, you see consistently that the fingers of Lucy are highly curved even by modern ape standards. You would never confuse these hands with human hands. And that's the conclusion of the authors. They said that the hands were surprisingly similar to what we see in the pygmy chimp or common chimp range. At Answers in Genesis, we're working now, actually it's one of my tasks there, we're making an exhibit that's going to be called the Anatomically Correct Lucy. And on one side, we're going to acquire or sort of duplicate a typical museum portrayal, secular museum portrayal of Lucy. I would love to get St. Louis's Lucy. And then in the middle, we'll have the skeleton, in other words, the actual data that we're working with. And then on the right, we'll have what we're going to call the anatomically correct Lucy. It will look like a chimp. It will be knuckle walking. We'll probably throw a banana in, you know, the whole works. Now you say, wait a minute, knuckle walker. You telling me Lucy was a knuckle walker? There's no museum that shows her as a knuckle walker. That would ruin everything. You'd never convince kids coming through in a science class if Lucy was down there being a knuckle walker. Well, this paper was published in Nature in March of '23, mentioned in Science News. And they're talking about two organisms, this one and this one. This is Lucy here, basically Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. And it said that these creatures had wrists capable of locking the hands in place during knuckle walking. You see, apes don't just walk on their hands. These kids in the classroom, I mean, if I were their teacher, they'd be walking on their knuckles, not on the palm of the hand. Walk on the knuckles, and if you walk on the knuckles, the wrist will collapse. It takes a lot of strength to support your weight on your knuckles. But apes can lock their wrists so that it doesn't require so much force to keep them straight. We don't walk on our knuckles, we walk on our legs no matter what the teacher of the grade school class says. And we have a locking device in our knee. There's a special muscle called a popliteus whose function is to put a couple degree turn between the femur and the tibia, and that sets a lock. So when you stand at attention and you do this, get those legs really straight, you can stand like this for quite a while without expending a lot of energy. But if somebody comes up behind you, ever have this happen? Give you a clip right behind the knees, down you go because they unset the lock. So we have that kind of lock. No ape has that. Apes that walk on their knuckles have locking wrists, and Lucy has locking wrists. So get her off that posture like this and get her down on her knuckles so we can see what she really looked like. Now here is what they portray as Lucy's feet. This is the most egregious misrepresentation in the whole Lucy thing. To this day, Lucy's feet are shown like this. They are virtually human in shape. They have ignored the bones that have been found of Australopithecus afarensis, showing that they couldn't have been looking like this at all. For example, going back to Stern and Sussman again. This is the toe bone. Look at the curvature compared to human. It's curved even by ape standards. These are apes. Here's how curved. These are apes. This is how curved Lucy is. So highly curved fingers and toes. Would not confuse either the hands or feet with a human. Now, it's interesting, the authors Stern and Sussman, their conclusion for hands and feet was this: there is no evidence that any existing primate has long, curved, heavily muscled hands and feet for any purpose other than to meet the demands of full or part-time tree-dwelling, arboreal life. So that was their conclusion. Now, Lucy to this day continues to be shown with human feet, even though we know better. For example, Discover magazine, back in 1996, and it's no different today, ignored the bones that could have been used to show what the feet look like and simply replaced the feet with human feet. Now, why? If we have bones that show the highly curved toes, why would you just ignore them and put human feet on afarensis or Lucy? I'm glad you asked. You see, here are the feet, and the article said, why did we ever get up on 2 feet? Okay. The reason they must put human feet on Lucy is because they adamantly insist that a creature like Lucy made those footprints that Mary Leakey found in Lutoli, Tanzania, about 800 or 900 miles away from where Lucy was found, by the way. And Mary Leakey found footprints. It was a trail 73 feet long. There were 20 larger footprints, the ones you see here, and it's left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, off into the distance. These are made in a volcanic ash. There are volcanoes in this area to this day that when they erupt, if it's raining at the time, the ash sort of sets up like plaster or cement. And so somebody must have been walking in wet volcanic ash, left these footprints behind. They were subsequently, and I would think very quickly, filled in with water-deposited sediment so that they've been preserved since they were made. Now, Mary Leakey and others believe that they are 4 million years old, which happens to be the current age of Lucy. And so Johansen insisted from the get-go when these were discovered that his Lucy made those footprints, or afarensis made those footprints. Now, in addition to the bigger individual, notice there's another set of footprints. Notice the stride for the big ones. This, 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 this. Look at the stride for the smaller ones. See how they had to increase the stride to keep up? So a smaller person was making bigger steps to keep up with the footprints of a larger person. And then this is neat. When Mary Leakey told me this, I had to get off the floor. She gave this lecture shortly after she found this at Washington University School of Medicine. Actually, it was in the main campus. And I heard the presentation. There's a third set of footprints up here. And you can look very carefully and you won't see them because there's the big set here and the small set here. Guess where the little set is? Each footprint, without missing a beat, is on top of the big footprints. And this little individual really had to do something like this to keep up. Now, when Mary mentioned this, you could see she was visibly embarrassed. First, she knows they weren't human. She knows there's some kind of an ape man. She's absolutely certain it wasn't Lucy because she knows Lucy doesn't have feet that could make this kind of a footprint. Johansen says Mary Leakey doesn't know very much about evolution, so the two have been in a big squabble over this. But today, most people like to think among evolutionists that a creature like Lucy made these footprints. But Mary talked about those little prints. She said, you know, it's interesting. Some tetrapods step in their own footprints, but she says this is clearly not a four-legged tetrapod. She says the Maasai, when they hunt, step in one another's footprints to keep the noise down. And then she was sort of embarrassed, and she said, and of course, little children just love to step in their elders' footprints in the snow and the mud and what have you. This is what one of those prints looked like when they were still fresh. By the way, they're supposed to be 4 million years old, but in the years since she found them back in the 80s, they have been absolutely disappearing. In other words, they're so fragile, so friable, that they're breaking down. They even recovered them, and they're still breaking down. But when it was fresh, this is the way the foot looked. Now, if you're a human anatomist, this is distinctly human. Not just in shape, here are the features you can look for, but it's the way the foot hits the ground and we push off as we walk. Humans have a distinctive left-right stride. Their heel hits first, and then the force goes up along the outside of the foot to the little toe, across the base of the toes, and we push off with our big toe. Absolutely human. I had an opportunity to ask Mary Leakey at a reception after her presentation the following question. Since you concede that they're virtually identical to habitually unshod modern humans, why not at least consider the possibility that they're human? And in that tone of voice that the British use for colonists, She said, ew, but surely you must know there were no humans around. Well, it settles that. People ask me all the time, how come we don't find human fossils in old strata? Hey, how about this one? What happens when you do? They get disqualified. Either the strata isn't as old as they thought it was because you found human fossils there, or they say it's not human. How are you going to stay ahead of that one? By the way, those of you that still don't know how to tell 8 feet from human feet, I thought I would throw this in. Another thing they talk about is Lucy's knee. I'll bet you've probably all heard about Lucy's knee at one time or another. This is the knee here, and the thing that's important is that, notice the femur comes down, and then this is the tibia, and if you were to run a line straight up from the tibia, notice that it would go up here because there's an angle here. That angle is called the carrying angle, or the valgus. And in humans, that's a 9-degree angle approximately, whereas you look at a gorilla, it's 0, chimp is 0. In other words, gorillas and chimps have straight legs. Humans are knock-kneed. Our femurs converge to our knees. You may think, bad idea, but it's a good idea. It keeps our feet together. You see, if our legs were straight, they'd be as far apart as our hips. So in women, they'd be, a little further yet because they have bigger hips for accommodating childbirth. And when you lift your left foot, you would tend to fall that way. And when you lift your right foot, you would fall this way. Now, you could prevent it. All you do is when you lift your right foot, throw your weight over the left. When you lift your left foot, throw your weight over the right. I will demonstrate. This is the way you walk. Ever see anything walk like this? Apes and academics, that's it. Those two. Now, I'm not picking on the academics. I can remember when I couldn't even spell academic, and now I are one. But anyway, apes, like gorillas and chimps, have straight legs. Humans have this 9-degree angle, and Lucy has a 15-degree angle. So evolutionists have used this to argue that, you see, Lucy was becoming adapted to walking. In fact, was indeed walking as we do, without having to throw the weight of the body from side to side in a perfectly good left-right stride, just the way someone would walk down the streets of Long Island or something like that, right? Now, what kind of questions should we be asking? What we should be asking is, well, that's interesting, but are there any living apes that have a high carrying angle? And absolutely. The orangutan has a 9-degree angle, the spider monkey has a 9-degree angle. What's the take-home lesson? A carrying angle does not necessarily mean a creature is becoming upright, walking on 2 legs. What are these animals doing with that carrying angle? They are walking on limbs in a tree like a tight wire walker. They have their arms up here and an upper limb. They're walking on the lower. And if I were to give instructions to a tight wire walker, I would say, try not to walk with your feet apart like this. Keep them together. So it's not evidence in itself that nobody believes the orangutan or spider monkey are on the verge of becoming human and doing ballet and things like that. And Stern and Sussman came to the same conclusions, that the overall structure of the knee is compatible with a significant amount of tree-like dwelling. Well, let's jump up to Discover magazine of 1996. I showed you the feet from that before. Absolutely human feet, though we know better now. But look at the hands. Is this not interesting? That's not what we saw in the mannequin in the St. Louis Zoo. These puppies are meat hooks. Highly curved fingers. That's what we want. That reflects the curvature that Stern and Sussman saw. But notice they didn't do it with the feet. They don't dare, because the feet must fit the Laetoli footprint. It's the best evidence we have that an ape-like creature walked just as we do. You know what it is? It's a problem just like the wicked stepsisters in the Cinderella story. They want to get those feet into that glass slipper, and they're going to try to get them into the glass slipper even though they don't fit. But they finally gave in on the hands. The other thing that's interesting is look at the hips. Those are what we call ape hips. What's the difference between ape hips and human hips? Here's chimp hips. The iliac blade, that's the bone that's under your belt here. goes from side to side. The iliac blades stick out like this on an ape, and on a human they come forward. I kind of liken it to a steering yoke on an airplane. You know, you got the shaft in the middle where the spinal column is, and you got the handles here. And so this is quite different from this, and this is important. Why? Because there's a muscle that goes from this bone down the outside of the leg to here, right in this area here, called the gluteus medius. It's under the gluteus maximus, which you're sitting on now. The gluteus medius is, if anything, more important than the gluteus maximus, even though it's smaller. When you lift your left leg, your left hip should drop, because this is an articulation. Think of a doll that's just got a hinge there. And when you lift your right leg, your right hip should drop. It doesn't, because when you lift your right leg, the gluteus medius contracts, squeezes here and keeps this from happening. And when you lift your left leg, the right gluteus medius contracts, keeps it from falling. Apes have a gluteus medius too. It goes down the backside. And apes have a posture like this. Never mind the ape man like so. They have a posture like this. Their problem is falling on their face, and the gluteus medius helps to keep them from falling forward. What does an ape do when it walks then? Same thing as it does with the straight leg. Without the gluteus medius, has to throw the weight over the planted foot. You're back to the wobble again. Now here's your problem. They know Lucy made the Laetoli footprints. The Laetoli footprints are identical to modern man and have the same stride, but sadly the feet aren't the right shape to fit the footprints. To add insult to injury, the hips would not allow that kind of walking. What will the solution be? Well, in most fields of science, you'd say, a really bad speculation we've got here, let's bag it and move on to something else. But in evolution, there are other solutions. Notice Stern and Sussman said the marked resemblance of Lucy's hip to the chimp is equally obvious. So this pelvis is like a chimp. Just a few years ago on television, the PBS Nova series, they had Dr. Owen Lovejoy on, who's a famous human evolutionist, and he was lamenting the fact that Lucy has ape hips, and that with ape hips, she couldn't walk like a human, but we know she did. So what's the solution? You are not going to believe what you're about to see. What you're about to see is science. Get it started here.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossilization.
So you get the picture? It was originally, according to him, shaped exactly like a human pelvis, but something happened to it that like maybe squashed it, so it was like this, but once it got squashed, it looked like a human pelvis. And according to the PBS series, they know who squashed it. Deer. I mean, I don't know about you, but I think the deer are taking over. We got to stop them. I mean, they're running into cars. They're stepping on our most priceless fossils. Here is the deer foot actually stomping Lucy's hips. Now, I have to tell you what you're going to hear, because you're not going to believe it when you hear it. I just want to get you ready for this. Lovejoy is going to hold up this fossil of hip bones, and he's going to say the following. These bones fit together so well, they're in an anatomically impossible position. That would be like you going into a body shop and somebody telling you, you know, your front right fender fits on your car so well, it's not possible. And he has a solution that I think you will agree it no longer fits well when he's done.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bone seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
Yeah, that would be a buzzsaw or a Dremel tool.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly,
it fit
like
real
a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
What can you say? This is science. You can teach this in a public school. You just can't criticize it. That would be religion. Oh, things have gotten worse for Lucy. I hate to even bring this up, but just a couple of months ago, April of 2007, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, yet another Lucy-type specimen has been discovered, Australopithecus afarensis. It's an almost perfect mandible with intact teeth, and it turns out it's a dead ringer for a gorilla, or very similar to a gorilla, very much unlike man or even a chimp. Their conclusion, this casts doubt on the role of Australopithecus afarensis as a modern human ancestor. Come full circle, huh? Well, let's let some evolutionists have a word here. This is David Pilbeam, a very distinguished paleoanthropologist, and he had just reviewed a book on human evolution by Richard Leakey, in which Richard Leakey basically says, we're going to have to forget everything we ever thought we knew about human evolution. I found some fossils here that throw everything into a cocked hat. His reward for that was to be booted out of the whole field of human evolution. He no longer works in it. He's in politics now. He's an outcast. His wife, Maeve, still works in it, but not him. And this is what Pilbeam said after reading Leakey's book. My reservations concern not so much this book, but the whole subject of paleoanthropology. But introductory books or book reviews are hardly the place to argue that perhaps generations of students of human evolution, including myself, have been flailing about in the dark, that our database is too sparse, too slippery, for it to be able to mold our theories. Rather, the theories are more statements about us and ideology than about the past. Paleoanthropology reveals more about how humans view themselves than it does about how humans came about, but that is heresy. Can you imagine that? My friends, the reason this is all important is because if God created us in His image, then we are the people of His pasture, as Psalm 100 said. It is God that sets the absolutes. He sets the rules. He tells us how He would have us live, and above all has come to save us through His Son Jesus from sin and death and the power of the devil. He did not come to save apes or animals. But if you have ape in your past, your morality is relative, and isn't that what Satan told Eve? If you eat of the fruit of this tree, you shall become as gods, knowing right from wrong or good from evil. You can decide for yourself. It's man that sets the rules. And when people start setting their own rules, it can get a little scary. I was watching a program on TV a few years ago. There was a handsome young man, went to the University of Wisconsin, had this wonderful Wisconsin accent that I've always gotten a kick out of. He was very articulate, very bright, very with it, very collected. He's the kind of person I would think any lady watching would say, oh, I wish my daughter could find someone like him to marry one day. One little problem. We're talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. This perfectly coherent, perfectly intelligent, attractive, bright guy said the following on the Stone Phillips show. If a person doesn't think there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. I always believed the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime. And when we died, you know, that was it, nothing. It makes a big difference, friends, whether we began as a primitive being and over millions of years of bloodshed, suffering, and disease worked our way up by random chance and natural selection to man, or whether, in fact, we were created with initial perfection and would have lived forever, and with the fall into sin, it's in fact been a downhill slide, not an uphill ascent. And finally, I just want to point out one of the most beautiful verses in all of Scripture. If you've lost somebody dear, indeed as I have, I lost a wife to cancer at the age of 48, 15 years ago or so now. And a verse like this just keeps you going. Jesus must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death. My friends, evolution makes death natural. Old earth makes death natural. If death becomes natural for you, if God is the author of death, not we through our fall into sin, it undermines the whole of Christianity. And pray that that never happened to any of us. Well, if this is a lecture you'd kind of like to see again, it's available. As Lucy, she's no lady. Did we have any products sent here, or do we have anything here to purchase? You do have some, okay. Okay, so there's one copy of this. It's probably about all you'd sell anyway after this lecture. But I have one on the hearing ear and the seeing eye that talks about the marvelous complexity of the ear and the eye that the Lord has given us to hear and read His Word. I have one on the Scopes trial, comparing it with the movie Inherit the Wind. I thought it had a cute title. Inherently Wind, a Hollywood history of the Scopes trial. And we sell them as a packet at AIG. In fact, you can get them for less than 40. I think they're 39 now. We've got to get rid of them somehow. And then our magazine. How many get our magazine, Answers Magazine? Good. I'd like to see so many. The rest of you, well, we'll be locking the doors, and you're going to have to agree to buy it before you leave. Well, if there are any questions, or we just take a break now, how should we handle this? Okay, when you look at Lucy, you see like a metacarpal bone. That's about it for the hands and really nothing for the feet. But Lucy is one specimen. There's at least 12 or 15 specimens nowadays of Australopithecus afarensis. None of the others are as complete as Lucy, which was 40% complete. But when you look at these other specimens, they include bones, for example, that Lucy doesn't have. So if you kind of pool everything together, I think we have a pretty good idea of how she was put together, or this creature was put together. I think we have enough information now from all of the specimens that have been found. We certainly have toe bones, we certainly have finger bones, to know that we have basically something very much like a pygmy chimp here. And that's how we're going to portray her in the museum. But unlike a secular museum, we're actually going to offer references for all of our decisions. In other words, you'll be able to get a reference in the scientific literature why we put the locking knuckles, why we got her walking on her knuckles. You don't see that in scientific museums, but you will in our creation museum. Any other questions? Yeah.
I wonder, do they have any other examples of those hip bones you got stuck on?
I don't know if we have, innominates that are as complete as that particular. That's what we call that one bone, which is kind of interesting. You see, the only bone in the body doesn't have a name. It's called the innominate, which is Latin for no name. All over the world, it's known as the innominate. No name. I'm not aware of, whether they just have fragmentary evidence, but certainly from this hip and from everything else we see, like the up-tilted glenoid fossa, suspensory adapted upper limbs, everything about this creature just screams the trees. Yeah?
Is it not true that Lucy's bones were found in different locations, even miles apart, maybe different strata?
Yeah, you hear this, that like one of the knee bones was found some distance away. That's really another specimen, and it hasn't been really incorporated into Lucy. What I showed you here are the bones that were reasonably associated with one another that leave me satisfied they represent one individual. But there have been other bones found, and I think sometimes there's a confusion whether a bone found some distance away is being claimed as being part of the Lucy group, I mean that very specimen, or simply representing A. afarensis, which would be fair. But of course, to argue it was actually part of this specimen, that would not be, and I don't think that's been done. Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of times that you thought that this is probably a male specimen rather than a female. Could you touch on that?
Yeah, the pelvis is one of the distinguishing differences between a male and a female. There's a pelvis type we call androgynous, it's very male-like, and then there's a pelvis that's more like the female pelvis. And males can't give birth to young because of the shape of their pelvis. It's more of a funnel shape, and females have a more of an open cone, you know, with a broad opening. It's still a tight fit, as you'll see in the next lecture. In fact, it's too tight, the baby's head won't fit through it. Pretty much brings the whole story to an end. But because of the shape of the hips, some have suggested it could have possibly been a male. Am I saying it is a male? No, I don't think we have probably good enough evidence to make a final decision on that. Any other questions? Yeah.
Were Lucy's bones found in the same formation as the Litowi footprints?
Well, they would argue that the dating that's been done shows them to be the same date, you know, and as you know, you can't date the fossil. There's nothing in Lucy's fossil that's datable because there's no carbon in it. It's rock, and there's no way to date a fossil that has become rock. And it's in sedimentary strata, and there's no way to date sedimentary strata. You're beginning to see a problem here. You can't date fossils, and you can't date the kind of strata that fossils are typically found in, sedimentary strata. The reason is sedimentary strata, and I don't think this is going to be a huge shock to you, is made of sediment. And sediment can be anything from gravel-like particles down to face powder-like particles that have settled out of water. And where did these particles come from? Well, the whole drainage bed to this area. And so this particle here, face powder-sized particle, might have come from Farmer Brown's West 40. And this one over here in the Mississippi River Delta might have come from Itasca State Park. It has two widely different sources. So there's no way to date an assemblage of particles that make up sedimentary rock. What is dated is igneous rock. And you might wonder, well, how does dating igneous rock help you? Well, it's the only thing that's datable by like uranium, thorium, lead, potassium, argon, etc. And what they do is they date lava fills that have flown in between the layers of the rock. We call them sills. And they think they have the date for the sill, and they interpret that for the fossil. Also, a lot of fossils are dated not by any radiometric dating, but just by general assumptions of the age of the strata based on other fossils found in it. So it gets to be pretty circular. You know how old the fossil is, therefore you know how old the strata is. You know how old the strata is, you know how old the fossil. And that's called an index fossil. That's basically what they were doing with Basil Cook's pig teeth. He knows how old the pig tooth is, therefore he knows how old the strata is. He knows how old the strata is because he knows how old the pig tooth is. Radiometric dating is, I think the top is beginning to just fall off from it. I've got a CD here that I actually got from a radio host here in the Denver area. What's his name yet, Don? Here it is. Enyart, yeah, Bob Enyart. And he had challenged the folks that found that dinosaur that had the marrow, the soft marrow in it, Mary Schweitzer and Jack Horner. They were in the Colorado area here. And Bob Enyart had worked up a total of $20,000 to give to Schweitzer and Horner to use in any way they see fit at their museum or in their research if they would just allow either the marrow or a piece of the bone to be carbon dated. And he basically, Horner told him, you couldn't come up with enough money for me to let you date it. And you know why, because he knows it's perfectly datable with radiocarbon. Unquestionably datable with radiocarbon. And they're willing to give all the money. I mean, would 40,000, would 80,000, I mean, what would it take? So far he's hanging tough, he's not going to let you date his fossil. And he finally conceded the reason he wouldn't is you'd use it against him. He knows it's datable with radiocarbon. And radiocarbon should date things what? At the most 50 with the newest techniques, possibly up to 100,000, but assuming there was a specimen that old. And these specimens are supposed to be like 70 million years old. It should be as cold could be for radiocarbon, carbon-14. And he knows that there's going to be plenty of carbon-14 in there. It's going to be well within the limits of error of the technique. And he knows that if he allows it to be tested, he's got a lot of explaining to do. So we got any believers in radiometric dating out there, let me just get you to do one thing. Get this lab to allow their specimen to be dated by radiocarbon. I think people need to have the courage of their convictions, don't you think? Yeah.
Related to the last question, how, geographically speaking, how far away was the Lucy specimen found from those?
Oh, I thought I mentioned in the lecture. It's about 900 miles away. Okay. So it's Tanzania and Ethiopia.
So it would have had to have been a different
Yeah, it wouldn't have been the Lucy specimen. It would have been another specimen of that species, according to Johansen. In fact, when you find a fossil, especially when you find one as remarkably complete on a relative scale as Lucy is, as the discoverer of this fossil, and as the one that gives it its name, A. afarensis, you then have the right to declare your specimen to be what they call a type specimen, against which all other specimens that claim to be the same species have to be measured against the type specimen. Guess what? Johansen did not declare Lucy to be the type specimen. He found a piece of jawbone near the footprints of Leakey and declared that to be the type specimen, I believe just to get an association of Lucy with the footprint site, because it would have been obvious to declare Lucy as the type specimen for A. afarensis. So the whole field is, whatever it is, it's not science. This is the Lucy specimen. I stood and stared at her for as long as my family would let me. Can't you just see the family? Come on, they're monkey bones, come on. I had butterflies in my stomach the whole time to look down at that little 3-foot, 8-inch skeleton, knowing how long ago she lived and how closely related we are to her. No words can do justice to the feeling you get. So he definitely got his $25 worth. The interesting thing is if you look around on the website for the Houston Museum, what about this? This is one thing I read there. For many years, Lucy was thought to be a direct human ancestor, but we now see her as belonging to a separate group of hominids from those which became our species, Homo sapiens. You get the picture here? Forget about it. She's not our direct ancestor. And yet, look what they say. Still, Lucy remains the benchmark. So she's not our ancestor, but she's the benchmark by which our ancestors are judged. Lucy remains the benchmark by which all other discoveries are judged. Lucy has become a household name known by scientists and non-scientists worldwide. She continues to inspire exploration of our ancient ancestors in order to discover more about the progress of mankind. So this is the reference standard. This is as good as it gets. I mean, we're going to look at the best shot that evolutionists have for human evolution, dealing. Thank you. Thank you. Hey. Normally I always say thank you, both of you, but that doesn't apply here. My goodness. First of all, I want to thank you for sticking to your guns. I understand they tried to palm off Ken Ham on you instead of me. And you said, Dave or nothing, and that's good. Don't let them. Just kidding, just kidding. Well, this is the organization I represent, Answers in Genesis. How many have been to the museum? I've talked to a few people. I'm sure if you just see who has been there, they would recommend a trip to Kentucky to see our museum. It is a 2-day affair if you're driving, 12 hours of driving, but the flight is a little faster, and you can get a direct flight from here right into Cincinnati, and once you're in Cincinnati at the airport, you're 5 miles from the museum, right on the interstate. So we hope to see you all out there. Well, I traveled about the country speaking a little bit. I retired in the year 2000 and started working on a part-time basis with Answers in Genesis, speaking all over the country. And then just a year ago, January 1st, I went full-time. So sold my house in St. Louis. I got $1.98 out of it. And of course, it had some acreage. And I bought a house in Kentucky, and so I'm a genuine Kentuckian. And I haven't learned how to speak Kentucky yet, but I'm working on it. Interested in just getting on the internet and looking at the Houston Museum. You'll see they're making a lot of hoopla about this. This is one of the screens you see. With regard to Lucy, they ask, how do you relate? I would have thought a better question would be, do you relate? But no, how do you relate? Notice the question's loaded. Another question they raise is, her story is your story. So in other words, if you see Lucy, look into her, you're really looking into your own background and history. She is being accompanied, or he as the case may be, to our country by a representative from Ethiopia, from the National Museum there. I won't try to pronounce the name, I'll probably get it all wrong, but here she is. And she's apparently going to be over here during the time the specimen's in our country. And she obviously is very close to this specimen. She says, I have an emotional thing with her. I have trouble thinking of her as a fossil sometimes. I sometimes consider her as a human being that has life in her. Well, it takes a fair amount of imagination from a rather beat-up monkey skeleton that's 40% complete. But a lot of people have visited the exhibit so far, and they consider it, at least the ones that have blogs that I've read, well worth the money spent. Even a lot of atheists are having genuinely religious experiences, just contemplating the skeleton of this particular ape. For example, this gentleman has a blog site that I looked in on, and he said, I stood and stared at her, and things kind of go down the hill from there. But we're going to have a critical examination of Australopithecus afarensis. Now you might wonder, why are we picking on this particular ape man? Well, there are a lot of ape men, as you know, or creatures believed to be ape men. And I believe they can all be fairly easily, wherever there's enough evidence to look at, be distinguished as either human or ape. I don't believe God made any ape men. But this is the one that's caught the public attention more than any other ape man. And this is the one I think that really impresses scientists most. So if we can critically evaluate this specimen, or this general type of specimen, Australopithecus afarensis, we can use pretty much the same sort of a critique or approach to critically evaluate the other so-called hominid ancestors. Lucy's so important that she's actually left her home country and has moved for 6 years to the United States, where over the next 6 years she will be on display at 10 museums. And for $25 to $30 a pop, you too can go and venerate some ape bones. Right now, Lucy's at the Houston Museum of Natural History. She'll be there for quite a while. The exhibit is called Lucy's Legacy, The Hidden Treasures of Ethiopia, which is where the specimen was found. This is what it looks like. We have a replica of this in our museum in Kentucky. It's about a 40% complete skeleton of a creature very much like a pygmy chimp, although you don't want to say that around them. They get offended. But you might be... Well, let's get into this talk. Everybody's interested in the origin of man. I mean, not too many people are interested in the origin of snails. Or cockroaches or moths or whatever. But when people talk about the origin of man, it draws some attention. And I think it's the whole idea of human evolution that probably sticks in the craw of Christians and creationists more than anything else. And I thought I would kind of get you in the mood for the talk this evening by showing you an exhibit that's been going on in London. It's called the Human Exhibit. You can go to the local zoo, the London Zoo, and there they have college students who've agreed to be the animals in the zoo. And so you go through and you can see them. You're not supposed to feed them, but you can You can see them in the cage there, and people have really sort of been titillated by this. This zoo visitor said, "It's hilarious. It turns everything upside down. It makes you think about humans in relation to the animals." Somebody else going through the zoo said, "Seeing people in a different environment among other animals teaches members of the public that the human is just another primate." Someone else going through said, "A lot of people think humans are above other animals. When they see humans as animals here, it kind of reminds us we're not that special." Isn't that encouraging? I mean, you go to the zoo. Well, I put this talk together some years ago. It's called Lucy, She's No Lady. For starters, it's probably a male.